All right, let's continue from where we left off with last time. So last time that we left off, we were talking about colonialism technology. And some of the technologies we were talking about were the steamships, which is there in the picture. Medicine, particularly, we were talking about vaccines, railroads, and the Maxim gun, which was our machine gun. And then for medicine, how that always kind of works is that you take a weak form of a virus and you inject it into someone so they become immune. So, for example, smallpox was pretty deadly. You know, a whole bunch of people got smallpox. And the way we figured out how to make people immune to smallpox was by giving them a weaker version of smallpox called cowpox. And then once people got cowpox, then they were immune to smallpox. So we just purposely injected people with cowpox to make them immune to smallpox. Railroads are pretty good because they allowed us to transport a heavy amount of goods on land from one place to another place across long stretches of area. Usually you would have to use boats to transport a whole bunch of heavy goods from one place to another, but the introduction of the railroad allows us to do that with just a railroad. And Maxim gun was a machine gun, which made wars very defensive. So with a machine gun, you could set up the Maxim gun, you could cover a pretty good amount of area in front of you with machine guns. So it allowed a small group of soldiers just to set up a defensive position and then hold that defensive position. And with that defensive position hold with machine gun, they could keep enemies, from getting in and such. All right, so positive and negatives of colonialism. We were doing a project about it. We didn't end up doing it. We did not end up doing a project about it. We were supposed to, but we didn't. So positive negatives of colonialism, positives being schools were built in the area, literacy rates improved. Negatives was, loss of way of life for the people that were living in Africa. You also had the problems of changing work conditions. By changing work conditions, I mean you have not quite slavery, but forced labor, which is basically slavery, but slightly better. All right, let's make a new bullet, and we're going to write down Boer Wars. So new bullet, Boer Wars. We talked about the Boer Wars before, but what ends up happening down in South Africa, there's a group of people living there called the Boers. Boer is a Dutch word for farmer. So I'm going to make a one, Boer, Dutch for farmer. So one, Boer, Dutch for farmer. So you had these Dutch farmers that were living in South Africa. And what ends up happening is that the Boers, they end up finding diamonds on their land. So you have these Boer farmers, these Dutch farmers, and they end up finding diamonds on the lands that they were farming. Well, the British wanted those diamonds, so they end up going to war against the Boers. I'm going to make a two and write down diamonds on Boer lands. So two, diamonds on Boer lands. So they end up finding all these diamonds on the Boer lands, and after they find all these diamonds in the Boer lands, British go to war against the Boers, fight them in a war, and during that war, the way how the British go about defeating the Boers is by throwing anyone that they find, like on a Boer farm. So anyone they find on the Boer farm, women, children, they chuck them into a concentration camp. That's basically how the British kind of won. They threw anybody that they could find that was a Boer into a concentration camp, burned down their farms, so that way the Boers had nothing to go back to, the people that were fighting against the British, and that eventually convinced the Boers to kind of give up after a lot of their properties and such were destroyed. However, a couple years after the Boers are defeated, South Africa, the entire area, including the Boers, gains its independence from Britain, and that's in 1910. So they gained their independence from Britain in 1910, and then there's a new government now in charge. Let's go ahead and make a bullet and write down the word apartheid. So bullet, apartheid. So South Africa becomes an independent nation. However, it's being run by white South Africans. Okay, so the nation of South Africa, Republic of South Africa, was being run by white South Africans. And they had a policy called apartheid, which means separateness. Go ahead and make a 1 and write down means separateness. So there was a policy of apartheid, which means separateness, and it separated the white South Africans from the black South Africans. Black South Africans had to carry around this little passbook that they had to have always with them that allowed them to leave their homelands areas. They had these areas, homelands, townships that the black South Africans had to live on, which is only about 13% of the land area was for the black South Africans, and then all the rest was controlled by the white South Africans. Yeah, and the black South Africans always had to carry around a book with them, a passport book. Now, one of the people that helps out in the area in gaining some civil rights or showing the way to civil rights was Mohandas K. Gandhi. Go ahead and make a 2 and write down Mohandas K. Gandhi. So Mohandas K. Gandhi, he was actually in South Africa as well. He was riding on a train in South Africa where he ends up getting kicked off the train because he was sitting in first class, but he was an Indian. He was a lawyer from India. So, he always traveled first class because, he had money. And he wasn't very happy about getting kicked out of first class because he's like, whoa, I paid for the ticket. So what ends up happening, he ends up organizing a lot of nonviolent protests and peaceful protests against the government of South Africa. And then again, nonviolent protest is when you're simply protesting something, but you're not using any violence. So the Indian South Africans had to also have a passbook as well, and a lot of them end up burning their passbooks in protest. All right, so that's a nonviolent protest. So you're not like assaulting anybody. You're burning this booklet that you have to have in protest. All right, so that's a nonviolent protest. So nonviolent protest is the practice of achieving goals through protest, civil disobedience, or economic or political non-cooperation, or other methods without the use of violence. All right, so that's what a peaceful protest is. Now, one of the people that picks up on the ideas of Mohandas K. Gandhi was Nelson Mandela. Go ahead and make a 3, and we're going to write down Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela, he is one of the people that picks up the ideas that Gandhi was doing. Once he picks up those ideas, he eventually becomes the leader of the African National Congress. The African National Congress is a political party. So it's a political party. They're not talking about like the entire government. It's like, hey, we have an African National Congress, like a Congress of representatives of just Africans. No. African National Congress is just a political party. I know that we call Congress here in the United States. That's where our representatives meet at and vote on laws, but African National Congress just means political party. I realize that's confusing, but nonetheless. So in any case, Nelson Mandela, he was in charge of the African National Congress. He was organizing protests against the government of South Africa. And he ends up getting arrested for his protest against South Africa. The government of South Africa claimed that Nelson Mandela was a communist, and they had a rule that they could arrest anybody who was a communist and throw him in jail. So they arrested Nelson Mandela for that. He wasn't, but that's the excuse that the South African government used. And remember that at the time period, Nelson Mandela protesting against the government of South Africa was after World War II. So after World War II, the United States didn't like Soviet Union, and I realized that South Africa is not the United States or the Soviet Union, but the South Africa was getting money and weapons from the United States, who didn't like the Soviet Union, therefore South Africa didn't like them either. Now, eventually Nelson Mandela goes on to become the first African president of South Africa. So Nelson Mandela is in jail for quite a long time until about 1991. He eventually gets let out of jail, then runs in the first election in South Africa in which Africans are allowed to vote in and participate in. And Nelson Mandela ends up winning that election, and he's president of South Africa for a while. He did eventually pass away, though, in 2013 at the age of 95. All right, and that's it for our big ideas.